I'd like to introduce Fran, who is our DWP Group President. She's on the National Executive, and she's been an absolutely tireless campaigner for a fair welfare system. So, Fran.
Thanks very much, Richard. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. As Richard says, I'm Fran Heathcote. I'm from the southwest, so it's always nice to come back and come a long way to be with you today. But I'm really pleased that I have, because events like this are dead important. They're dead important if we're going to, as Richard said, maintain as much unity as possible. With the welfare system that we've got, there's a huge potential for division, and our job is to make sure we pull all that together. But I want to speak about the issues facing our union and our class, and about what needs to be done in order to defend and improve our conditions, and why we need an alternative to the system based on privatisation, profiteering, low wages and seemingly endless race to the bottom. We have the utter scandal of people dying in corridors in our hospitals through the chronic underfunding of the NHS. Underfunding and the great lie of unaffordability is the method whereby the Tories attempt to destroy confidence in the public sector before claiming that only the private sector can resolve the problems through privatisation. For decades now, the ruling class and their governments, either Tory or New Labour, have chopped away at the two main pillars of the welfare state, the social security system and the NHS. And having had considerable success in dismantling the social security system, they now want to step up the dismantling of the NHS itself. And I would urge people to join the demonstrations in defence of the NHS and to join the fight for a new deal for working people organised on the 12th of May by the TUC in its campaign for better public sector pay. But we're going to need to do a lot more than just march. The TUC itself needs to make clear that the underfunding and the privatisation of the NHS is utterly unacceptable, and a united response from across the entire movement is required. Future generations will look back in astonishment at the fact that Tories are systematically stealing from us our most important asset, and all of that without one day of action from our movement. Attacks on the unemployed, the disabled and the public sector, not least the public sector pay freeze, do not stem from the fact that the Tories are nasty. It is a strategy. Our members understand that the attacks on the NHS, on the public sector pay and on the welfare state all come from the same single source. And I would argue that welfare reform is not just a plank of the government's agenda. I'd go further and say it is the central plank. It is also in reality an agenda shared by all of the main parties to some extent, and that's changing, I think, with the current leadership of the Labour Party, and that's to be welcomed. With our members under vicious attack, and we are doing all we can to build the biggest alliance possible in order to defeat welfare reform. But since the Ken Loach film I, Daniel Blake was screened several years ago, vast numbers of Labour MPs still abstained on the Tory welfare reform bill, instead of opposing it and calling for an alternative, so we still have a long way to go. We need to recognise that defeating this government on welfare is not just about sanctions, or the disgraced ATOS or Maximus or work capability assessments, important as all of those are. We need a campaign across the whole movement arguing for the defence of the welfare state, taken into every workplace and community. The involvement of our members who deal with workers on benefits, certainly, but the involvement of all unions in the TUC as well, because all of our members will be affected when the attacks that are brought about by universal credit come in fully. The current regime has to be scrapped. It's excessive, it results in severe financial penalty and hardship, and it's massively disproportionate to the alleged offence. It is this regime that is driving thousands of the poorest in society into poverty. PCS is working closely with the PCS Parliamentary Group and with shadow ministers to produce a vision for welfare and social security in order to put pressure on the Labour Party and others to articulate their strategy on welfare. Reinstate the social security safety net. This disappeared with the abolition of crisis loans. The rapid growth of food banks has proven the need for an effective safety net. The value of benefits must at least keep pace with inflation. The 1% cap on uprating has to be abolished. The work capability assessment has failed. A new method of assessing entitlement has to be introduced that ends the disastrous experiment of relying on the private sector. The criteria for qualifying for the personal independence payment has been drawn far too tightly, with many claimants failing to receive the financial support that they need. Again, the disastrous use of the private sector in the PIP assessment process needs to be ended. The introduction of charges for using the new child maintenance scheme is a tax on family breakup. People need support, not charges at these difficult times. The work programme has proven to be an expensive failure and has made little or no difference to getting the long-term unemployed and the disabled into work, and it has to be scrapped. The staffing cuts imposed on the DWP since May 2010 has led to the loss of over 30,000 staff. This has led to severe arrears of work, building, and many not getting the benefits that they are entitled to. A large-scale permanent staffing increase is required urgently to put DWP back on its feet. Office closures mean that the public cannot get the help and advice they need from properly trained and resourced public servants. The disastrous DWP People and Locations Programme, or Office Closure Programme to be more accurate, was never about people. It was about closing offices across the network to save a few more, and making it harder for the most vulnerable to get to offices to access our services. Universal credit, the combination of monthly payments, rental costs being direct to the claimant and the household, rather than personal payments, will inevitably lead to evictions and arrears. The proposals under universal credit to introduce conditionality for claimants in low-paid work who currently receive tax credits serves no purpose other than to further stigmatise the poorest people in society. It will make you see a problem not just for those in work, but also for the unemployed, the sick and the disabled. We will all be subject to conditionality. 40% of PCS members processing universal credit will also be in receipt of it because of the government's low rates of pay. Universal credit is a great example of how welfare reform is not about making things better or fairer. Between 5 and 7 million people in work will be on universal credit, subject to conditionality, further highlighting a new layer in society, the working poor. Precarious, low-paid work on zero-hours contracts is not the answer, and zero-hours contracts are an equality issue. 1 in 4 women workers in the UK are in low-paid work. Of those, 1 in 8 is on a zero-hours contract. The Fawcett Society says that 1 in 5 women earning less than the living wage is educated to degree level. What a damning indictment for Tory Britain. The so-called two-child rule or rape clause, where benefits will be limited to 2 children unless you can prove that the 3rd child is the product of rape, is a clear example of how low this government is prepared to go in its efforts to stigmatise benefit claimants. Universal credit is an attempt to institutionalise low pay. It is an operational disaster and a policy nightmare. Without going into further statistics, one little anecdote tells you all that you need to know about the impact of austerity cuts. The Peace Monitoring Group in Northern Ireland has said that the biggest threat now to the peace process is the welfare cuts programme. The aim of this government, though, is twofold: to cut and centralise services as a prelude to privatisation, and to get people used to the idea that they are simply not entitled to efficient, accessible services present in their communities. And that is why you have to continue to argue and campaign for an alternative to the idea that only the private sector can deliver and that the public sector needs to be run into the ground. And that is why we reiterate our core policy: no cuts, no privatisation. And we have to fight even harder for our alternative. The ideological offensive that has taken place over decades mean that we have to define ourselves not just in terms of what we oppose, but also articulate what we stand for. And that means a welfare state based on need, not profit. A fair and equitable taxation system designed to meet the needs of the majority in society, not for the minority. A social security system based on need, not moral judgments. Committed to full employment that ensures a decent standard of living for everybody. A fully funded and properly resourced public sector, a system where people have access to decent housing, healthcare, education and culture, decent pensions and an end to child poverty. We have to recognise that unless we're prepared to stand up and fight for these things, then the race to the bottom will not just continue, it will accelerate. Capitalism conceded the welfare state and the NHS, not because they're nice people. They did so on the basis of generations of struggle by our movement, and they would take us back to the Victorian age if it meant maximising their own wealth. And that is why we reiterate our ideals that a better society is possible, and that is why we have to fight for it. PCS prefers the term social security to welfare reform, the idea that in a civilised society there's a basic level of decency below which nobody should be allowed to fall. Our welfare state was not established to provide a free labour subsidy for profitable private companies, driving down pay and replacing paid work. Social security is about ensuring dignity for all, a decent home where you don't have to choose between heating and eating, where you don't have to skip meals at the end of the month because your money has run out. And we must advocate for a fair and just welfare system, certainly, but we also have to articulate and advocate for the sort of society that we want to live in. We need to make clear that there is an alternative to austerity. This government is intent on shrinking the state. There is no need for cuts in public services or further privatisations. Creating jobs will boost the economy and cut the deficit. We should invest in housing, renewable energy and public transport. There is a £120 billion tax gap of evaded, avoided and uncollected taxes in this country every year, at the same time as the government is sacking all the staff that collect the taxes. The UK debt is still lower than other major economies. There really are workable alternatives, but we have to be prepared to campaign together, work together and fight for them. PCS wants to work with anybody who's prepared to fight the cuts and challenge austerity, and we recognise that that will take the biggest possible coalition of the willing. And so in finishing, I thank you very much for listening and urge you to do all you can with unions, campaign groups and in communities, and let's set about building social security together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Fran. Nice rousing speech to get us all started and to stress the idea that, as some joker once said, we are all in it together.